Chapter 11. Singapore parties backwards into war. On Thursday, the 25th of September, Kenneth started letter number 46. I'm starting my weekend airmail letter tonight, because I'm going to have a most hectic weekend and probably shan't have much time. The next day, the 26th of September, he had had 4 letters from Molly. 2 posted on the 29th of June and the 2nd of July, and 2 airmail dated 3rd and 10th of August, the last having taken only just over 6 weeks, which he comments on as really remarkably good, but perhaps the route, via the Cape, is getting better now, as we seem to be coping with the Battle of the Atlantic a little better. The 2 earlier letters had much better news of the children and their health, and talk of all 3 of them enjoying life together, including Jeremy, so I imagine he got over the scarlet fever all right, and came home in time for the holiday. I do wish I could see them all too. They'll be very much changed by now. In number 30 letter you talk about arranging a passage for all of you with the Admiralty. I'm very much wondering how far that all went, although of course I know that you stopped all arrangements because of the Far Eastern situation. That has more or less settled down again, and I do hope you are once more thinking of the trip out. I feel that will be hell, as you say, but not nearly so bad now as it would have been when I came out, and your chances of getting safely across are now about 300 to 1 instead of 200 to 1. I think the worst part will be looking after the 2 children in the heat which you'll have during a lot of the passage, because with darkened ships it is much more unpleasant at sea now than in peacetime. However, once you've got over that, the life out here is so marvellous that I think you'll think it was worthwhile. I wonder if you are still thinking of bringing Jeremy out. England seems so comparatively safe now, I mean compared with 6 months ago, that I shall be inclined to leave him behind if you don't think he'll suffer too much mentally. That's why I suggest you wait till the end of January before you come. If you're bringing him, you might as well start straight away. I should certainly leave before February the 28th, so that you can bring Johnny free of charge. I'm sorry the snaps I sent you make me look fat in the face. I don't think I've altered the slightest bit, except that my hair seems to be going back a little faster. I am quite brown, although not mahogany, and extremely fit as the climate suits me marvellously. I think you'll find it suits you too. It's by no means hot. But the Far East situation had by no means settled down. On the 27th of September, the USA instituted an embargo on exporting scrap metal to Japan, and in retaliation, Japan signed a tripartite agreement with Germany and Italy, who were, of course, already at war with Britain. On the 29th of September, Duff Cooper held a conference in Singapore with the highest civil and military authorities in the Far East to discuss the worsening situation. This explains why Kenneth had had a hectic weekend in preparation. According to Farrell, it was generally agreed that there was no serious danger of Japanese attack in the south for some months. If that was the view of his bosses, it is not surprising that Kenneth wrote that the situation had more or less settled down again, but, with hindsight, it is clear that from that date war was inevitable. It had probably been inevitable from a much earlier date, and for many months British military plans had been discussed and rejected for lack of resources and uncertainty over US support. Around the end of September, Churchill proposed that a flying squadron of the Royal Navy be sent to Singapore, according to Farrell, to encourage the Empire, impress the neutrals, reassure the United States, and deter the Japanese. This plan went through various stages, from being a strong fleet of older ships to being a smaller force of faster, newer ships. All this depended on the war going well for the Royal Navy in the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean. In fact, the Navy had suffered heavy losses in the Mediterranean, and many of the older ships needed refitting. For example, they still lacked radar. In the meantime, life at the base in Singapore went on as normal. Kenneth hopes that Molly has met his predecessor as CD Captain Loveband, who was now back in England. He had been a sad and lonely man in Singapore in the process of divorcing his wife, who ran off with another captain out here, or very nearly did, and was sent home. Having received several letters recently from Molly, there is more reflection on matters at home, the 26th and the 29th of September, and the usual oblique reference to Molly coming out to join him, although by now he must have known that was not likely. I'm so glad you've started Jeremy on tennis. I think it's so important they should be taught young and properly taught. Golf can easily be learned later, but tennis, no. I may say you'd hardly recognise my tennis, I'm so steady these days. I can almost guarantee to return the ball even after it has bounced. Our own court is an absolute godsend, although it's by no means good, and we use it nearly every day. I'm delighted to hear your bank balance is the right side for once. I am cabling £200 early in October to help with my overdraft, and so you can pay your own passage if necessary. I am thoroughly worn out after my weekend, and have decided I'm never voluntarily going out in the evening again until you come out. Saturday was the worst because our two girlfriends, army officers' wives, insisted on visiting all the haunts, Tanglin and Raffles, as well as the Coconut Grove, and by the time I got to bed at 2:30 I was quite dead. Consequently, I didn't enjoy my golf on Sunday, nor Sunday evening very much. I'm afraid I'm feeling my age, darling, and dancing with young things doesn't amuse me any more. I shall love taking you round, and then we can just sit and watch the others unless we really want to dance, and that will be much more fun. It must seem fantastic to you in England listening to all this talk of dancing and nightlife. I know I was aghast when I came out, and I still think it's a mistake, but I'm afraid it's inherent in the country, and until the war comes very much closer, it won't stop. I understand the Clipper doesn't go till later on in the week, so I'll keep this letter open and perhaps add some more tomorrow night. I've got to dine with the Chief of Staff tonight, which is rather a tribulation. Au revoir, darling. The Chief of Staff at this stage was Captain Hutton, whose post carried with it the rank of Commodore Second Class. Next day Kenneth reported that it had been a very pleasant party, but there were 2 wives there who had just come out, and I was rather bemoaning the fact that you had not been encouraged to come. What was my surprise to get your letter, number 40, this morning, to say that the Admiralty had given you permission to travel, and also that Jeremy was prepared to be left behind and was taking it so bravely. I don't think I've ever been so pleased in my life. I've been a changed man all day, and I've wanted to tell everyone we met. I have told most of them. It's the most wonderful news, darling. When are you coming? Don't wait too long, will you, because it seems so safe at present, and I feel if you wait something may turn up to put you off. I wrote another Clipper letter to Jeremy today, thanking him for being so brave about it, and altogether I'm so thrilled and can hardly think. Please send me a cable saying when you're thinking of sailing, if you haven't already done so. By the 1st of October, hope of Molly's passage had revived. The Japanese situation has improved again. Kenneth's mood has improved in consequence, and he apologises for the tone of some of his earlier letters, to which Molly replies are now reaching him months later. I'm very ashamed of some of the depressing letters I've written in the meantime. My trials and tribulations are as nothing compared with yours. I have no great decisions to make, but only to wait and hope. I hope your difficulties are nearly solved by now, and that you are just waiting for passage, or perhaps waiting for the end of the Christmas holidays. Thank you for the snaps of the children and Jeremy and Jane's letters, enclosed in 2 of your last letters. I love the snaps of Johnny, but was disappointed there were none of you, darling. I'm never satisfied, am I? The one of Johnny holding out his hand like Mussolini, and the two of him in the shallow end of the pool are simply glorious. I'm longing to have him out here, and all the young children seem to be extremely healthy, although the ones over about 4 do get pale unless they go up the hills, where they all acquire lovely rosy cheeks. I think it'll probably be good for Jane to go away to school as well. As we shall have an Armagh to look after you and Johnny, you should have very little work, so that if you want to employ your typing capabilities, I can easily get you a half-time job, forenoons only, on the base at $65 a month. Otherwise you will have to expend a lot of your energies on knitting, sewing, and Red Cross works, or at least as captain of the dockyard's wife some such good works will be expected of you. Poor Mrs. Spooner is finding life rather difficult with a new house and new boys and a certain amount of entertaining, and neither she nor her husband understand the Eastern mentality, nor have they the right temperament to tolerate it. You shouldn't suffer from any of those difficulties, as your house and staff are perfect and are waiting your ladyship. Later in the same letter we read, We had our first wedding in my church on the base yesterday, with the reception at the CE's house next door. CE stands for Chief Engineer, and CE's house was presumably Captain E. Blythe's house, as he was the father of the bride, Seska Blythe. The groom was Adrian Sharp, Paymaster Lieutenant A.L. Sharp, RNVR, who was listed for duty in the Admiral's office. According to the Navy list, Captain Blythe was only appointed CE on the 13th of October 1941, a month after the wedding, succeeding Captain R.P. Chapman. The letter of the 1st of October continues. I see the Nelson has been in action at last. I'm so glad they've had some fun and no casualties. I wonder if she's remaining in the Mediterranean. And I wonder how G. Miles is enjoying himself in Moscow. I think I'd rather be in Singapore, with the chance of my darling wife joining me. Thank you so much, my dear, for your remarks in letter number 33 about our victory over matrimonial difficulties. I'm glad you feel like I do about it, and I agree that our success is all the more pleasant because of the difficulties we undoubtedly did meet. Anyhow, I'm feeling wonderfully happy now with our family and ourselves, and I'm praying that we are allowed to enjoy the fruits of our victory. Fun, of course, is relative. Captain Miles left the Nelson in June 1941, and was then part of a government mission to Moscow. Despite the Japanese threat, or perhaps because the Japanese threat was discounted, Kenneth had 2 more peaceful Sundays. On the 5th of October he did an hour's gardening before breakfast, and went to the morning service at 9:30. I'm longing for the day I can take you and Jane into our little church. We sit in the front now on the right, and the C&C and Lady Leighton on the left of the aisle. I'm afraid the congregation is still only about a dozen, and the choir about 14. Even my reading of the lesson hasn't attracted anyone else. I went to the office after church, but found very little outstanding, so here I am. Peacock and Cole are coming to lunch with me, and then we were going out to Bukit Timah for golf. I played in my first competition there yesterday from a handicap of 9 and played extremely badly. Yesterday evening I dined with the Baileys, our next-door neighbours, and went into Singapore afterwards to see the amazing Dr. Clitterhouse, done by an amateur company which included Leigh Butt, the man who came out in the ship with me, film star. It was really very good, and I quite enjoyed the 3 hours of it, 9:30 to 12:30, although it was the 3rd time I'd seen it, including having seen the same company on Thursday. That was at Johore, when the Spooners and us and a few others, including the Sultan's old sister, aged 70, dined with the General Advisor and went on afterwards. The General Advisor, who is the head Britisher on the Johor government, and a man I have to keep in with, especially as he often supplies me with seedlings for my garden. Kenneth had also visited the botanical gardens, buying various seedlings and cuttings and learning how to take cuttings himself. His garden, it seems, was getting lovelier every day. No doubt an incentive for Molly to start her journey. Another intended incentive related to the Baileys. Commander E.G.L. Bailey had been Assistant Chief Engineer since April 1938, and Kenneth believed that he had been in China when Molly was there, 1926. He was probably a young Lieutenant E. then. They are a very nice couple. They've got 2 very nice children, and it is Mrs. Bailey who has arranged about Jane's schooling for me. Meanwhile, Jonathan was evidently beginning to talk. It sounds rather as though he is going to be halfway between Jane and Jeremy, not quite so late as Jane in talking, I hope. How grand that Jeremy will be in the 5th form this term. He must be coming on very fast. I hope you told R.G. that he was definitely staying. Kenneth's next letter is dated the 13th of October, though there was one, number 49, which is missing from the numbered sequence. Kenneth had been suffering from rheumatism. Mrs. Harkness and the Siamese cat have been looking after him, and he finds sitting up and writing rather painful. Before the rheumatism struck him down, Kenneth had had some journalists round here on Thursday. We very often do have them. Amongst this party was Mora, the American who spent about 9 years in Germany and was kicked out by the Nazis a few years ago. He wrote Wings Over Germany, or Europe, or something like that, and several other books. He was certainly most interested, both about Germany and about America. I hope he's coming to dine with me soon when he comes back from a visit to the NEI, Netherlands, East Indies, modern Indonesia. He knows Hitler and most of the other leaders in Germany quite well, and is most entertaining anyhow. Writing for Kenneth may have been a pain, but he was catching up on his reading. Philip and Alexandra of Macedon was rather difficult because of the masses of footnotes. More interesting was a short book by a Japanese soldier on his experiences in the early stages of the war against China. It's rather like All Quiet on the Western Front, and is quite interesting as I suppose it represents the Japanese point of view. He's a very ordinary man and doesn't seem to know anything about the reason for the war, but has implicit faith in his superiors, and is quite willing to die for the Emperor. It's merely another book to show us how stupid war is, and how unnecessary. I wonder what will happen if Japan begins to attack the Russians in Siberia. I suppose we shall come in then, although there's not much we can actually do in the offensive line out here, except from an economic point of view. Anyhow, I'm afraid it will be another nail in the coffin of your ideas of coming out to Singapore. I don't think the Japs will attack us or the USA, but if Russia collapses on her western front, she will almost certainly be attacked in the rear by Japan. However, if Russia has held out successfully till the time you get this letter, I think you can safely come. Kenneth believes that Japan is likely to attack Russia first, but is still apparently confidently expecting Molly to have a safe passage to Singapore. If nothing worse has happened by mid-November, but don't leave it too late and get caught in a spring blitz on England or in the Atlantic. Though he does admit that all this talk about her coming is really to keep his spirits up. I still realise you can't come if Japan gets nasty, but they've lifted the ban altogether out here now, so the powers that be must think the risk is fairly small. Or was that another political gesture to instill confidence in the Americans and Australians? That letter, 14th of October, started. Jeremy's birthday, and the day on which I committed the unforgivable crime of not coming up to London to see you, presumably to Beckenham from Davenport. I didn't realise it at the time, but I do now. But then, of course, now I shouldn't have any inclination to commit such a crime. I wouldn't dream of being away from you on any occasion when I could possibly be with you, certainly not an occasion like that. I thought I loved you in those days. In fact, I did love you as much as I was then capable of, but it didn't compare with my feelings for you now, when you mean everything in the world to me. Incidentally, I was terrified of going to Beckenham in those days, and perhaps I'm not quite so frightened of meeting your mother nowadays. Not that anything would keep me away from you, now that I know you love me as much as I love you. That letter finished in similar regretful style, and with a touch of dramatic irony. However, as I say, all this planning is really to keep my courage up. I think I should just pass out now if I knew you couldn't come, or else I should apply for a sea job. I can't stand this lovely shore job by myself for 2 years. Already I'm getting terribly neurotic, and being rude to everyone and terribly impatient, all against my better judgment. I'm sorry, darling, don't worry. I shall survive somehow. But God knows I miss you and I need you terribly. All my love, sweetheart, to you and the children. Kenneth. On the 18th of October, Kenneth reported having his first free afternoon for several months, and being completely at a loose end, because he had been told not to play any games for a bit. So the Saturday and Sunday golf is off. I can't think what I shall do with myself all tomorrow, and as luck would have it, Monday is a Malay holiday, the end of Ramadan I think, and the dockyard is closed, so I shall have 2 whole days which I should have spent at Bukit Timah, wasted. It's not really as bad as that, because I've got lots to do really, but you know how I hate being idle. I shall probably spend the forenoons of both days at the office, and tomorrow afternoon I'm going to do a little sunbathing and swimming at a bungalow just up the Straits from here. That is, if it's fine. We've been having rather sultry weather lately, with a good deal of rain at last, and not much sun. I expect you are saying, why don't I garden? Well, gardening here is really what I like. It's just a matter of walking round and telling the gardeners, who can't speak a word of English, what you want done. True, I do a certain amount of watering and pruning, and occasionally plant some seeds or change some pot plants, and have even done a little weeding. But you can't sort of settle down to an afternoon digging. Incidentally, I've never seen a spade out here, or a fork. They use a sort of thing like a mattock, called a chuckle, for all digging, and I couldn't wield one even if I tried, I don't think. Also, of course, one would lose a tremendous amount of face by doing any hard work. The garden is, as a matter of fact, looking lovelier every day. I've got a lot of phlox out now, red and mauve and purples and a few white. They seem much more like sweet williams than the phlox we have at home, but they're a lovely colour. Also, I'm cultivating lots of young bushes of different coloured bougainvillea, and I've got some glorious orange ones as well as reds and purples. They're lovely to grow because they are always in flower, and they like as little soil and trouble as possible. I sit out in the garden for my early morning tea nowadays. Lots of people round us have breakfast in the garden. The Chevaliers have all their meals except lunch, but it's usually pretty hot in the sun by 8 a.m, and we have very little shade except at the back, which is all kitchen garden and boys' quarters, and at places rather too far from the house for convenience of serving. So I sit out there from 7 to 7:45 and read the paper, and then go in and have my bath and breakfast. I'm making all arrangements, though, to have supper out there when you come out, and when we're by ourselves, which isn't often in this place, as one's usually dining out or having a dinner party. As a bachelor, I don't get asked out much now. The early spate is over. But when you come, I expect we shall have few peaceful evenings for the first 6 months. I'm still talking peacefully about when you come out. I must say that the Russian situation at present doesn't look very hopeful, and of course on that depends the matter of peace or war in the Pacific, and on that, happiness or misery. Anyhow, I keep on hoping because otherwise I should go mad. I've had 3 letters from you since I last wrote. Number 38 of 30th of July by sea, and numbers 43 and 44 of 17th and 20th of August by air. The airmail ones usually gain about a fortnight on the sea ones, and so are well worth it, but of course the long bit of the journey is from England to the Cape. He apologises again that his earlier letters must have been rather depressing, and that he gets fits of depression when not at his best. But photos from home have cheered him. I love the toothy snaps you sent of Jane with Richard. At least I suppose it's Richard, although it looks much too old for what I thought he was. What a change since I last saw him. Jane looks cheerful anyway. I'm sorry to hear Jeremy is so pale after his scarlet fever. Fancy getting the form prize despite being away half the term or more. He must be getting more and more interesting. Has he got a Bible of his own? If not, will you give him one for Christmas from me, and mark the following verses for him? Ecclesiastes 9, verse 10, and Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. They are the ones my father marked for me when he gave me the Bible I've still got just before I went to Osborne in 1915. On that Monday of the Malay holiday, the 20th of October, Britain took the first steps towards trying to strengthen the position of Singapore. It was decided to dispatch the modern battleship Prince of Wales and the new aircraft carrier Indomitable, ostensibly to South Africa, but in fact to Singapore, and the old battlecruiser Repulse from the Indian Ocean direct to Singapore. There had been a great row between the naval staff on one side, who appreciated the weak deterrent value of this fleet, and Churchill and his ministers on the other side, who desperately wanted a gesture of our determination to encourage our friends and allies, especially Australia and the USA. One can understand the Navy's reluctance to send 2 of their latest ships to the other side of the world as a political gesture. The Prince of Wales, only completed 7 months earlier, had had a short but eventful career, including action against the German battleship Bismarck when still not fully operational, repairs in Norfolk, Virginia, and further action in the Mediterranean. In August, the ship had famously taken Churchill to meet the American President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, for the Shipboard Conference off Newfoundland, in which mutual defence strategy was the agenda. The United States was not in the war against Germany at this time, but was offering all aid to Britain short of war, according to Churchill. The Indomitable was only launched in March 1941 and commissioned on the 1st of October, less than 3 weeks before the decision to send her to Singapore, and was planning to work up in the West Indies. The decision to send Force Z, as it was known, is not reflected in Kenneth's letters, though the next 2 are rather shorter than usual and written in the office. There is talk of old friends, Pitt, who Molly might have remembered from Erebus days, and young Summer from London days, who came to play tennis. Pitt, a retired lieutenant commander and Chinese interpreter, had a lovely little bungalow outside the naval base on the shore of the Johore Strait, with his own little garden leading down to a pier out into the water. He is a nudist amongst other things, and his garden is eminently suitable as it's completely shut off from the outside world by mangroves. I went there mainly for peace, and also to try some sun treatment on my rheumatic old back. I sunbathed from 10:30 to 1 p.m, and had to go to church first and do my duty, interspersed with occasional plunges into the sea to cool off. It was lovely, and the sun was better than I expected, so I got thoroughly burnt, and am a trifle sore in parts today. However, it was grand, and I think has done a little good. I am certainly going again. Pitt, incidentally, is also a connoisseur of Chinese pottery and Malay sarongs and sandals and things like that, and has promised to take me round the market in Singapore some day. On the 21st, Kenneth had been to the beating of the retreat by the 5th and 2nd Punjabis, whose second-in-command, Major Webb, husband of Peggy Scott from Hong Kong, remembered Molly from when he, then a lieutenant, had been in Hong Kong with the same battalion 12 years earlier. A few days later, Kenneth had played tennis with Major Webb, and with Harry and Joan Reed. "Why has everyone got their wife here except me? Cole's wife arrived a couple of days ago too, and I think I'm one of the very few grass widowers now. Eccles is leaving by air for England tomorrow, and then I shall be alone. Chevalier was made an acting commander 2 days ago, after being a lieutenant commander for 16 years or so. He's managed to buy the last brass hat in Singapore, and looks magnificent. I acted as godfather at the christening of their new daughter the other day. I got her a christening present of a spoon with Daphne from Mr. Kenneth engraved on it, and then the day of the christening they changed their minds and called her Joan." Kenneth was only proxy godfather, because the baby was a girl and her godfather was not in Singapore. Had Daphne been a boy, Kenneth would have been his second godfather, it being the standard in those days to have 2 godparents of the same sex as the baby, and one of the opposite sex. Next day, Sunday, the 26th of October, it is golf again, against Admiral Spooner and Cole. Mrs. Cole was there and asked to be remembered to you, and like everyone else said, "Tell her she must come out here." Cole says it's really quite easy to get passages through the Admiralty and the Ministry of Shipping. The companies have no say in the matter, so if the situation ever warrants it, I will stir my stumps and get the Admiralty to do something about it. The same evening, Kenneth reports playing bridge with the Spooners and the Coles, so there was plenty of time for sports still, but the tone of these late October letters is more serious, even though there is no direct mention of the Japanese situation. On the 25th, Kenneth writes that he is really very busy these days and doesn't get much time for reading. The situation doesn't warrant him trying to stir the Admiralty for a passage for Molly, and that letter continues. "At present you're better where you are, I'm sure, for the children's sake. If it goes on like this and you can't come out, I shall begin to wish we really could start fighting out here. I hate to see all this extravagant life going on with a nation fighting for its very existence." On the 29th of October, another batch of 8 letters had arrived from Molly, and Kenneth has the complete story up to number 45 of the 24th of August, without a single letter missing. The letters were not arriving in the order they were sent, some by sea and some by air. Number 45 was sent by air and had evidently taken 2 months. The later letters were not so cheerful, but Kenneth blames himself for Molly's worries about coming out. "I'm quite certain you're right not to attempt it now, darling, and I shan't worry you any more unless there's a very definite turn for the better in the war situation." Kenneth is clearly aware that the situation is getting worse. "Japan still seems to be hovering, doesn't she? I imagine she must be in a terrible position economically, and that it will be essential for her to decide in a week or 2 which way to jump. To climb down would be almost impossible for her present ruling class, so I think it's either a revolution or war. I can't believe any thinking Japanese wants war, but they may be forced into it to maintain face. If Russia should stage a comeback in the next few weeks, we may see a complete change out here, but it doesn't look likely." Perhaps because of this clear awareness of Japan's predicament, and to take his mind off the impending crisis, he writes about Lumley and the possibility of building a fruit cage there. "If there's any wire netting left over at the end of the war, how lovely it must be there now, I look at your picture of it longingly every day and wonder if we shall ever be back there again. Your mother and father must be making a wonderful garden of it. This garden here is getting more and more beautiful too. It's a mass of colour now, and I've planted several more trees and shrubs that I bought at the Botanical Gardens. I'm also trying to grow creeper all over the surround of the tennis court. The golf course I told you about in my early letters is taking shape at last. I got £200 out of the Admiralty for it, but can't get any grass-cutting instruments. However, the greens and tees and bunkers are being made. Peacock does most of the work. What fun meeting the Clarksons again! You must have had great fun in the summer holidays. I do hope these Christmas ones will be as good, and that you won't be worrying about me or about coming out here. I'm quite miserable, but I couldn't be miserable in nicer surroundings, so that must console us, and also I shall never give up hope of your coming out. I was delighted to hear that Jane took her sports so well, and didn't worry too much about winning. You certainly took the right line, as usual. Bless you. This mirror on our summer holidays at Goblin Combe reflects one incident which I remember. I believe that the Clarksons had lived in one of the flats above us in Sliema in 1938. We cycled over to visit them in their large, elegant house somewhere near Yatton. Kenneth had dined again with the Spooners and heard some amusing stories about Douglas Dobble, who had been Admiral Spooner's flag lieutenant in Scotland, and completely inefficient. October ended with Kenneth apparently still optimistic, somewhat against his better judgment, and perhaps mainly to encourage Molly. Another month has gone by, and in about a fortnight's time I shall have been out here 6 months. That means a quarter of my time gone, provided the war ends in the next 2 years. I feel if there is war out here, and it's still going on, it may not be so easy to get relieved, although they do seem to be swappable people around. The Admiral is terribly optimistic and reckons it'll all be over by next spring, including licking the Japanese. However, that may be, I'm still expecting you out here next spring. You may only get a week's warning from the Admiralty, so I hope you'll keep your bags packed, as it were. The Harknesses are having a house built for them, and I expect we'll be moving in any case about next April, so you might just as well come out then, or else I shall have to take it in some more lodgers, probably very unpleasant. I must say I do feel something big will happen in this war before the end of the year. I can't believe the Germans can go on much longer expending the terrific effort that they are at present in Russia. Think of the daily expenditure in petrol alone and the wastage in machines so many hundreds of miles from home. They're marvellous organisers, of course, but I can't help feeling they expected a Russian collapse earlier than this. The Russian wastage must be terrible too, but they've held out so well to date one can't help being optimistic, especially as they seem to hang together even after retreating hundreds of miles. It's an interesting war, if only it was just in the history books and not affecting us. On the 3rd of November, HMS Indomitable ran aground in the West Indies during her work-up and went to Norfolk, Virginia for repairs. This accident deprived the much-reduced flying squadron, which was slowly assembling for the defence of Singapore, of a major unit. On the 3rd of November, HMS Indomitable ran aground in the West Indies during her work-up and went to Norfolk, Virginia for repairs. This accident deprived the much-reduced flying squadron, which was slowly assembling for the defence of Singapore, of a major unit. It could be said that the Indomitable was the vital ingredient that might have provided the air cover that Force Z otherwise lacked. Or, in the event, it might just have been another victim, given our underestimate of Japanese air power at that time. Preparations for the even more reduced Force Z went on, even though its possible contribution at this stage was probably only as a bluff. The thinking seems to have been that the Japanese aircraft were no match for the RAF, and that modern warships could deal with the attack from the air. Japanese preparations for a land attack on Malaya and Singapore were considerably more advanced. British Army and RAF plans for countering such an attack were in confusion due to political sensitivities not shared by the Japanese over a preemptive invasion of neutral Thailand. The war must by now have been affecting Singapore Naval Base behind the scenes, but there were few hints of this in the captain of the dockyard's letters home through November. On the 5th of November, he reported that his life wasn't very interesting, and if it was, I suppose, I couldn't talk about it. We see a few interesting people, including Edgar Maurer, who came to dinner with me last week, and Sir A. Wavell, who I had to escort round the dockyard yesterday. I am getting terribly unsociable and altogether rather unpleasant, and all that would be completely changed if you were here. I don't know what it is that annoys me out here so much with most of the people. I think it's their outlook on life. There's no one here with more than one child. Most of them have none, and there's no family life at all. Everyone seems to live for parties and scandal. I think that's partly what's wrong with our generation altogether, the lack of children, and the preponderant number of childless families. Or am I being terribly smug and self-satisfied? Anyhow, out here the women seem to spend most of their time complaining about the servants and the shops. Goodness knows, both are far better than they'd ever get at home, and most of the men seem to be complaining about the inefficiency of everyone else. I've hardly met a man out here, Chevalier is a very notable exception, who can get on with his own work as well as possible and let other people alone. Everyone seems to spend their lives running down someone else. It's terribly catching too. I love scandal, as you know, and find myself doing just the same as everyone else. The only difference I can think of is that I am quite willing to admit that I myself am totally incompetent at my own job, and lazy too. In a way, I suppose the whole thing is a matter of nerves. This place has been on the verge of war for so long that people are in the same state they were in Europe in 1939, with the added trouble of the climate, which is apt to get on people's nerves after a time. Usually, no one does more than 3 or 4 years without leave out here, and home leave is almost non-existent now, so that there are several who have done 5 or 6. However, that shouldn't apply to the naval or dockyard officers, and especially those who have their wives with them. Miranda is calling out to ask me to go and read to her. The Harknesses are out. I only wish it was Jane. CD's workload seems to have increased, but it was not what he thought he had been trained for. My duties are many and varied, what with schools, fire brigade, police, ships, clubs and churches, as well as several court-martials. The fire brigade features in a letter of the 12th of November. I'm getting some 400 more Malays to form an AFS as an adjunct to our proper fire brigade, which in itself is one of the very best fire brigades in the East, I should say. Much better than the Singapore Municipal Brigade, I think. We have a hard-headed North Countryman from Sunderland in charge. He's the most difficult man I've ever had under me, with no sense of humour whatsoever, and an utter contempt for almost everyone else's work, especially anything to do with dockyards. He gets everyone's backs up, but he usually gets what he wants, which is always several 100% more than the Admiralty are prepared to pay for, and he is undoubtedly very efficient as a fireman. Clubs feature in an earlier letter, together with further comments on morale. On Friday night, the 31st of October, I went to the yearly dance of the Base Sailing Club. It was quite fun, although I went by myself and just joined up with other people's parties. The club is built out on piles over the sea, the Straits of Johore, and is the only building that was here before the base was started, when it belonged to some rich Chinese and was used as a gambling den, I think. A pier has now been added to it, and the whole veranda and pier were used for this dance, lit up with red, white and blue fairy lights, and rather lovely, especially as there was an almost full moon. I've just come back from the office, having gone on there from church. To continue about the sailing club dance, I had rather an embarrassing time one way or another, because it is mainly used by the more junior dockyard officers, several of whom I have trouble with from time to time. The very first person I met was a man who only the day before I had prohibited from driving a car in the base for a week, as I had nearly been run into him driving in the middle of the night with no lights. The second was another man who had left the dockyard a couple of months ago, and to whom I had refused a pass for admittance to the base. Several others there were whose cameras I had confiscated for taking photographs on the base. You see, I'm in the unfortunate position of being sort of executive officer of the base, and discipline amongst some of the civilian officers is quite hopeless, in addition to which most of them don't realise there's a war on, and security means nothing to them. I must admit lots of naval officers are just as bad, but they don't come under me. Anyhow, I quite enjoyed my dance, and I suppose it's a good thing that they should know I'm really quite human. Ship movements had seemingly increased, and he was thinking of buying a second car. A large American one, probably. I have to save about £400 this year somehow, and instead of putting it all in the bank, I thought I might invest £200 or so in a car, which I can probably sell for as much as, or more, than I bought it for in a year or so's time. It would be very useful because so many ships come in here from time to time, and the officers can never get any fun because it's too expensive for them even to get to Singapore or to the golf course. If I have another car, I can send parties of them in occasionally and use my little old Morris and its ration of petrol for my own use in the dockyard and base. The naval base alone is 6 miles long, and I often have to visit other of our establishments, which are scattered all over the island. It's a pretty poor excuse, but if I can't use the money for your passage, I may as well find some use for it. The base golf course, which had been a particular personal project, progressed slowly, and in a letter from which the first page is missing, probably removed by Molly rather than the censor, he wrote, "Peacock is going off at last, having been delayed several times, and so I've lost my golfing companion. Today I'm taking Shaw with me instead, the husband of Joyce Brownrigg's sister, who is here now. Peacock is taking back his mandarin coat for you. I do hope it fetches up safely, because although it's not much of a present, it's rather a lovely coat. I shall miss Peacock very much, especially as he had very little work to do and was acting as managing director of my golf course. He used to go out there every day and tell the coolies what wanted doing, and his sailors used to go out and cut down the trees where necessary. I'm terribly dubious about this course. Everyone is clamouring to have it, and I'm afraid it'll never be a golf course. It's being built in more or less jungle area, and although I'm getting greens and tees of a sort, the fairways are much worse than anything you'll ever meet as rough on a decent course. Incidentally, the greens won't be much better than a good many average fairways. It apparently takes years to make a green out here, and turf is unobtainable. Progress is also being made on his own tennis court. I played tennis yesterday evening for the first time for many weeks. I played in Singapore, where they only get about half as much rain as we do out here, and I played abominably badly. I find I can only play well if I play regularly, and even a week or 10 days without a game sends me right back to scratch. However, I've returfed the bare patches on our own lawn, and in about 3 weeks' time we should be able to start again here if the Japs haven't come first. The Japanese weren't there first, but they were to make their intentions clear within 3 weeks. In the meantime, mention of the war is mainly of the Russian front. Friday, the 7th of November. The news doesn't vary much these days, does it? One can't help admiring the German military organisation. It's really rather marvellous the way they go on feeding and supplying those millions of men and machines with such terrifically long lines of communication. However, the Russians are still holding on manfully. I wonder when and where we shall start to do something. We always seem to wait for Hitler's next move, but I suppose we're not strong enough to take the initiative in the West and in the Mediterranean yet, or we should have done something. By next year the Germans may be able to bring back some of their air force and army from the East, but let's hope not. However, by mid-November, despite the continuing reports of sporting and social activities, there seems to be a greater sense of things being about to happen. My darling, I meant to write a long and cheerful letter to you today in answer to your very nice ones, 49, 50 and 51 in the middle of September, but I'm afraid I'm terribly tired and feeling rather depressed with my work, and it may not be as cheerful as I meant. I specially kept this evening completely free so that I could write a long letter, but I've been kept rather later at my office than usual. It's nearly 6 now, and I shall certainly go to bed as soon as I've had my supper. It's a great deal my own fault that I'm so tired, and it's probably because I'm so tired that I feel depressed and feel that everything is going wrong. I really started tiring myself out on Saturday, the 15th of November, because I played in a frightfully strenuous hockey match after playing golf, and then went on to a dinner party afterwards, and was kept out of bed till about 2 a.m. However, after that things did rather go against me. I was called about 6 on Sunday to a fire in the dockyard which turned out to be a false alarm. I then had 2 lessons to read in church instead of the usual 1, that was very tiring, and had a lot of work to do after church. I've played a little golf in the afternoon in pouring rain, and then I rather stupidly played bridge till around 11 p.m. instead of going to bed. Monday was a most trying day, full of conferences and everything in my department seeming to go wrong. Chevalier is on leave, and I have his work to do as well as my own. Monday evening there was a cocktail party in one of the ships, but luckily I managed to go to bed early. I was first called around 12:15 on Tuesday morning by a wrong number on the telephone. The telephone is in the next room, so entailed me getting up properly. That was followed at 1:15 a.m. by another telephone call, this time for a fire in one of the ships in dry dock. I had to go down and superintend this, and found the fire brigade there in force, and the fire with a really good hold. We pumped water solidly, and it wasn't till about 6:15 that the fire was under control. I got home for a shave and some breakfast, and then had another bad day in the office, so that by the evening I was fairly tired. Unfortunately, I'd chosen last night to chuck what should have been rather a good party. I'd sought out all the prettiest girls I knew in Singapore, and asked 9 NOs from a newly arrived cruiser. I shared the party with the Baileys next door. We all met in my house, 12 men and 9 girls, dined in the 2 houses and danced afterwards to a radiogram at the Baileys. All went well, I think, although the standard of beauty and charm of the girls was far too high for the officers who turned up, who were rather dull. However, by the time I got to bed, I'd been up for 25 hours. No afternoon rests here either. I had an early job this morning too, and 2 very hot and tiring hours later in the forenoon in a boat surveying a mangrove swamp. This afternoon has been hell. Needless to say, I wasn't at my best, and from 2 to 5 I had a constant stream of people in my office complaining about this, that and the other. Oh, for a job at sea. Now I've got that off my mind, I feel a bit better, thank you, darling. Unfortunately, I've only put off most of the troubles and not settled them. I rather hope that war will come to us out here. It might make people pull together a little better and forget to run down everyone else. There is no doubt that Kenneth felt himself to be in a professional backwater, and is envious of those of his friends who are at sea. The same letter continues. I am sorry to see John Gillan is missing. I've no doubt he was excellent as a wartime leader. Bill Agnew seems to have done well, doesn't he? And I see lots of other naval friends of ours have got DSOs and DSCs, including Guy Morris, Ravenhill, Robson and Unwell, and many others. I think mainly for Crete and Libya. Incidentally, I hear Graham Gladstone was saved but badly shaken up. I hope he gets a good leave. Towards the end of the month, he is once again reflecting news from home, but in the context of his situation. Wednesday, the 26th of November. Even the Far Eastern War seems much further off here than it does to you at home. We are still peace-minded. Most unfortunate from some points of view. Jeremy sounds most interesting these days. I wish I could think of more to say to him in letters, but one can't talk about the ships and things here which would interest him so much. He would love this place, and I could show him so much of these colossal ships and of the dockyard in general. However, he'll be in it himself in a few years now, I suppose. God bless you, sweetheart, and all my love. The reference to colossal ships is interesting. In the context of 1941, it would be taken to mean battleships and perhaps heavy cruisers, though the only heavy cruiser I know to have been in the area at the time was the Exeter, and that was smaller than the London and its sister ships, with which I had been familiar in Malta. Perhaps he was anticipating the arrival of the Prince of Wales and Repulse. Perhaps Kenneth was anticipating what would certainly be old news by the time Molly read that letter. Events were starting to move fast after the lazy days of autumn. From Kenneth's early December letters. December 1st. Another month and we are in the very middle of one of the periodical Far Eastern crises. They certainly seem to get more critical each time, but I still have faith in my original conviction that Japan will remain on the fence and get just as much as she can by bluffing. She can surely be under no delusion that we are bluffing, or that America is by now. The Prince of Wales and Repulse arrived very publicly on the 2nd of December, with 4 old and rather battered destroyers, and no aircraft carrier. Kenneth wrote the next day. Wednesday, the 3rd of December. We've had a busy time this last day or two, as no doubt your papers have told you. There appears to be no secrecy about naval movements out here at the moment. Unfortunately, it seems to have started a spate of official dinners as well, and I had to arrive with the Spooners last night to say goodbye to the late C&C, and again tonight to meet the Duff Coopers, Brooke Pophams, and the new C&C. I quite enjoy these parties occasionally, but I must admit that I feel much better next day if I go to bed early and get up early. Unknown to the diners, no doubt passing the port and toasting the king in traditional fashion, Japanese troop transports were heading for Thailand. However, things were changing at the base. On the 5th of December, after his second interesting dinner party, Kenneth wrote, It's very difficult to get away from the office much before 5:30 these days. As no doubt you'll read, we now have a fleet out here, and it does make for a lot of extra work to begin with. It's going to mean a lot of reshuffling of personnel too, and I understand I may be losing my job in a few days and taking over something which is slightly more attached to the Navy. I believe I'm going to remain in this house, so I shan't have anything to grumble at. We will never know what the something more attached to the Navy might have been. Whatever the plan, Kenneth still had time for tennis, and for comment on letters from home, and for reminiscences, in what was the last longish letter that he wrote from C.D.'s house, Singapore. Friday, 5th of December. My darling, I sent off a special Christmas letter to you yesterday. We are allowed 40 grams each for one free letter which goes by air the whole way via Cairo. I hope it fetches up all right. How time does fly, even when one's not really happy. It's just over a year now since I flew down from Scapa for that week's leave. Or was that the end of October? Anyhow, it's nearly a year since I left the Nelson and had that nightmare trip down to London. I was terrified of what awaited us in London then, and wasn't at all well either. It'll soon be a year since that last marvellous fortnight and that horrible morning in Glasgow. I suppose I can last out 2.5 years without you. It's not going to be easy, especially if the war spreads to England again. However, we'll see. We've opened up our tennis court again, and what a difference it does make to get a couple of sets in the evening. Today was all the Amar's days off, apparently, and the Chevys arrived complete with family to play with us for half an hour. Pat and Felicity Jean through the garden, while Chevy had to wheel the baby round by road in her pram. Chevy loves it, and he had to leave sharp at 6 to give Felicity Jane her bath. Pat having gone at 5:30 with the baby. I've managed to get you some Kirby grips of a sort, as you see. I've got several even longer ones, which I'll send in the next letter. I hope these won't make my letter overweight. I had another long letter from Anthony MacDonald today. He writes very well, and I also had the usual long rigmarole from Uncle Willie, enclosing another he had written in July but forgotten to post. He really is very kind to go on writing, and to take such a fatherly interest in you at home. I hope I shall see him again. I had Gil to supper last night. He's had a most interesting time for the last 18 months, and has 16 different addresses in the last 6 months. In consequence, he hasn't heard from his wife for months and months. If you happen to have her address, do write and tell her he is well and cheerful, will you? He is off at the moment, and I forgot to ask for her address. The next morning, Saturday, the 6th of December, Kenneth, still dining and thinking about tennis, added, "Darling, I'm afraid I shall have to cut this letter short. The H's had 2 guests to dinner last night, and we sat and talked till about 11, so that I had no time to finish this letter which I had started before dinner. Now it's breakfast time on Saturday, and I only have about 10 minutes, or I shall be late for the office. The war out here really looks as though it may begin any moment, although I still can't see why either side should want it. I suppose we've got to stand firm, or Japan will merely go on taking bits of other people's land, and we can hardly let China down, and I suppose the Japanese militants think they must strike now, or relapse into a second-class power. Why can't we all be content to be second-class powers? People like the Norwegians and Dutch are just as much respected in general as Germans and Englishmen and Americans, and certainly Chinese are more respected than Japanese. It's all so stupid, but if we do fight out here, don't worry about me, darling. We have lots of food and nice shelters, and a much better air force than the Japs can bring within reach. I only hope they don't drop a bomb on my tennis court." What was the conversation at the Harknesses about until 11 that night? They may not have known that Japanese invasion fleets heading westward from southern Thailand or northern Malaya had been sighted by Australian pilots from Singapore. If they did, they seemed still to have been confident that the meagre and obsolete RAF strength in the colony could deal with them, or they may have shared Admiral Tom Phillips's confidence in the deterrent effect of 2 powerful warships, despite their lack of air cover.